Okay, first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to the third Time for Action webinar. We appreciate you coming. Thank you, spending your time here this afternoon. I'd like to acknowledge that Rolly Montpellier, my colleague, and Kathleen O'Hare, my other colleague, are both on the unceded territory of the Algonquins in the Ottawa area. And another point, I've just been passed a note by our producers that the work of another Donald apparently will be being discussed in great length this afternoon as well. And the other Donald's a bit of a media hog, so we may have trouble keeping attendance here, but we're going to go ahead with it anyways. Zoom's such a hard room to play. I've been a great fan of Donald Gutstein, who will be speaking today, ever since I first picked up a copy of The Big Stall and started reading it a couple years ago. It's just so full of detailed information over 50 years of the oil and gas industry messing with policy, creating think tanks, infiltrating governments in Alberta and federally in particular, and just an endless parade of obstruction and interference. And Donald has just done a remarkable detective job putting together all the details of what happened at the Paris Climate Accord, but also far, far before then, right back into the 1970s and 80s. And he combines that with an analysis of neoliberalism, which I think is extraordinary and spot on, and really helps us understand. I think it's required reading. I kept telling everyone they had to read this book. If they were concerned about climate action, you just simply had to read the book. And so luckily, we're lucky enough to have him. He's agreed graciously to be with us this afternoon. So I'd like to turn it over now to Kathleen, who's going to do the first half hour, interviewing Donald. And then I'm going to ask some follow-up questions, and then we'll go to the audience for questions. So please put your questions in the chat or the Q&A. Thanks very much. Kathleen?
Thanks, Ken, and welcome to Donald Gutstein and our viewers. As Ken said, the Big Stall is just full of information. But Donald, I get the impression that you really are drawing two parallels between the growth of neoliberalism and the growth of the climate crisis. And I'd like to kind of unpack those. During and after the Second World War, partly as Seth Klein has pointed out in his great book, A Good War, government played a really strong role in putting the country on a war footing and then creating social programs. And so government was engaged, but there were people around the world who didn't like this tendency. And you've studied them. Could you start by telling us a bit about the opposition to government engagement?
Thank you, Kathleen, and it's great to be here with you today and participating in this webinar. Yes, and after the Second World War, neoliberalism was formally organized, but actually started before the Second World War, during the 30s, when what was happening was that governments had been bringing in social programs before and after the Second World War, and then during the 30s, with the Great Depression and the New Deal in the United States in particular, but also in Europe, governments became massively involved in planning the economy and in providing social programs. So this group of people, who we would have called classical liberals in the 19th century, that is, they believed in laissez-faire, which means just let it be, just let the market go on its own steam. But they could no longer espouse that perspective because people had seen the good things that government could do. And so the neoliberals had to come up with a new role for government. And that role was that instead of government serving the people, government would serve the market or the economy. And so that's where the neo comes in. It's a new role. And so after they met during the 30s, but then the Second World War created a diversion for about 10 years where nothing happened. Then in 1947, Friedrich Hayek, who was an Austrian economist and political philosopher. He invited his like-minded people to meet in the Swiss spa town of Montpellier. And there they met for about 10 days, about 35 of them from the US, from Britain, from Germany and France. And they were economists, they were a few historians, some conservative business people, and a couple of journalists. And they came up with a program to try and turn the economy away from government involvement. So that was the source of it, and I think that we want to look at next maybe how they went about organizing themselves.
Well, Donald, you talk about dealers, secondhand dealers in ideas, and their whole plan to market and basically change our value system. And they did that from 47, their founding meeting. For the next, it took them a couple of decades to really infiltrate into our society. Could you just tell us how organized they were and how much they achieved?
Well, it's a fascinating story, really. And let's keep in mind that neoliberalism was a fringe movement of radical ideas. It would have never gone anywhere without the support of wealthy conservative businessmen who financed their activities for several decades. So that's the first thing. And they realized, Hayek was a genius in realizing that the only way you can really change society is by changing the ideas which are important in the society. And so we have the idea of government planning, social programs, and we need and how to move thinking away from that and back towards an unfettered market that would solve these problems. And just want to preview that, as you said, it took a couple of decades before they were successful. But when Keynesianism, which was the dominant economy after the Second World War, about government involvement in the economy and demand and supply management, when that ran into trouble in the 1970s, the neoliberals were right there. They had their monetarism, deregulation, privatization. They had the whole package, and they presented the alternative that was quickly picked up by all kinds of governments. However, when neoliberalism ran into similar problems in 2008 with the global financial meltdown, with no ideas were available for what else to do. So after a brief return to Keynesianism, pumping hundreds of billions of dollars into the banks and the economy, they went back to neoliberalism. So I guess at the end of the day, the lesson is that if anybody wants to move away from neoliberalism, they have to sort of follow the path that neoliberalism has taken.
You mean we have to have a lot of money and a lot of good marketers, which so far we haven't had, really. Well, I know you talk about how Pierre Trudeau, who was more or less pre-neoliberal, was so much more engaged in society, creating Petrocan, trying to regional development, social programs. So what has changed Canada with neoliberalism? I mean, you talk about privatization and deregulation, but what has happened to government? What are we dealing with under Justin Trudeau?
Okay, well, before we get to Justin, I think I need to show how neoliberalism has worked, how they've been successful in changing the climate of ideas, and then we can apply it here in Canada, because Canada fits perfectly under the whole system. So Hayek's idea was to create this Montpellieran society, which is like at the center of of the whole enterprise. And at the first, it was about 35 people, but now there could be 1,200 to 2,000 members of the Multi-Tolerance Society. It's still active. They meet every year. They have conferences. They develop their ideas about them. And then what Hayek had said was how to get these ideas out into society. So he came up with the idea of the think tank. I mean, the think tanks had existed before, but this was a new role for think tanks. That is, they're to take neoliberal ideology and create research that proves the ideology. It's not research as we normally understand to find out what's going on. Their research was always to demonstrate, come up with the proof that neoliberalism works, that private schools are better than public schools, that markets are always better than governments do. So the first neoliberal think tank was set up in London in 1956 at Hayek's urging. And so this think tank worked for about 2 decades, turning out these studies that were distributed to meet people in the media. And I'll get to the secondhand dealers in a minute. And over 2 decades, the ideas changed so that 1956, the Institute for Economic Affairs, 1975, Margaret Thatcher is elected head of the Conservative Party, and 4 years later, she becomes the first neoliberal prime minister. The same thing happened in the United States in 1980 with Ronald Reagan. So just by the repetition, the repeating the same studies over and over again and distributing to what Hayek called the secondhand dealers in ideas. And these are people in the media, but they're also novelists, they're teachers, they're church ministers. They're people who don't create ideas themselves, but translate ideas that are understandable by their audiences, okay? And so that was the whole system that he put into place.
I'd like to get to, before we run out of time, I'd like to start dealing with the parallel development, which was the climate crisis. And in the late 70s and the 80s, even big oil started to get worried about greenhouse gas, the greenhouse effect and things. And then finally in 1988, James Hansen of NASA announced basically to the world that the climate crisis was here, or the climate change was here. And that year they started the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was founded. What was the reaction before that and just after that in terms of big oil? Was it still denialist?
Okay, well, big oil discovered it in the 70s and 80s that the reality of carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere and the resultant rise in global warming. At first, they kept it quiet, but during the 80s, it became academic institutions, government researchers found out this was happening, and that's what led to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988. And James Hansen, the NASA scientist who was testifying before the U.S. Congress that year, and it was a very hot year. There was a drought, heat waves, and he said to Congress, 99% certain that global warming is here, and that became news headlines around the world. So big oil's first response was to set up this global climate coalition to about 50 big companies to deny that that it was happening. But that was problematic. And this is where neoliberalism and big oil came together. These neoliberal think tanks were already successfully denying the link between secondhand smoke and lung cancer. They had been doing that for a number of years. getting paid big dollars by the tobacco companies. Well, let's just switch to denying global warming. It was an easy transition to make. And before long, Exxon, the Koch brothers, uh, lots of oil and gas companies were funding the think tanks to deny that there was a link between use of oil and gas and global warming. They denied it was happening. They said if it was happening, it was due to sunspots. That was a big thing. They said, well, if it is, they said, and there's still some people around today saying that. They said, well, if it's happening, it's good because agriculture can always use carbon dioxide. So they did this for 20 years, 2 decades, and they were really successful in creating chaos and confusion and undermining the public will to really move ahead and do something about it. So I'd say that was their first great success.
But then didn't they decide that they'd better be a little more diplomatic about it and less blatant? And you talk about the meeting in Stockholm in 72 and then Rio in 92, but there was also the Brundtland Commission talking about sustainable development. So it sounds like big oil decided to take a more tactful approach. If you can't beat them, join them in a way, and mislead them. Can you tell us about that? Big oil's sort of nicer face.
Okay, well, we go back to every 5 years, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced a new report. And each report became more and more definitive and certain of the reality of global warming. So by about 2005, that you can no longer deny that this was happening. So what I talk about in the book is a big pivot. Just around the time of the financial meltdown and the need to rebuild the economy, they came up with the idea of a green economy. And so that happened long before now, and they would accept that global warming was happening. They would say that Canadian government had to have an energy policy for dealing with this. That could include carbon pricing, which was coming into favor at that time, and so they switched to this new approach. But the approach was still for a growing economy, even though it was going to be greener. And so that's what the tack they took, and they're still taking to a large extent today with some modifications.
So, I mean, there is a lot of talk now about clean, smart prosperity, clean growth. These all sound really positive. So how is big oil misleading us? How is this part of the big stall, in your opinion? Because, I mean, let's face it, since Trudeau came in, Trudeau the younger, there has not been a diminishment of emissions, but there's been a lot of nice talk. So is this the new part of the big stall? Is all this nice green conversation and fairly vague green promises?
Yes, it is. It's a new approach. The culprit here was the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2015, which did not have mandatory levels. It didn't say that you had to cut your emissions, and if you didn't, you would be fined. All kinds of things that government could do. Instead, governments were just going to try their best to work in this direction. So that would just left everything so open and so flexible that what we have now is the idea that we can cut our emissions and we can have a fantastic, prosperous future at the same time. So I'd say that's the new rhetoric that underlies this clean economy, sustainable growth, smart growth, all of these different means that are our efforts to persuade us that we still don't need strong government regulation. And so anything that they can do to prevent that they'll do it.
Speaking of Paris, your chapter on Paris, the Paris Agreement, is Paris, big oil gets its deal. And you point out that in France, in Paris, big oil, big French oil, funded the Paris discussions and the eventual agreement. I mean, why are they, when you talked about tobacco, you point out that the World Health Organization would no longer let the tobacco manufacturers in on the discussions about how to stop tobacco use. So can you just give us a sense of how compromised, because the Paris Agreement was, because so many people put a lot of faith in that. That was going to save us, and there were cheers and tears and everything. But can you just give us a sense of what was going on behind the scenes that has prevented us from making any headway in the last 5 years?
Okay, well, I think the thinking is that big oil caused the problem, so they're probably the best people to help deal with it. Some kind of thinking like that. And Paris was the last chance to get a deal. It had all been set up that way. So big business, big oil had gotten together for years to bring them all together on the same page, so that they could speak with one voice. And they had a massive organizing effort. And the French government, yes, like most governments, were compromised in not being able to keep distance with corporations. And so Énergie, the company, the French electricity and energy company, was one of the sponsors. Now, being a sponsor, that gave them inside track. They were in there with all of the national delegations talking about these deals, whereas the environmentalists, the indigenous groups, the farmers, youth, they were all outside trying to lobby and trying to have some impact. But look at the difference. The effect was so different. So that's how it was organized to make this happen. And I just noticed that when the Conference of the Parties 26 happens in November in Glasgow, they've said that they're going to make sure that corporations that pollute cannot be sponsors this year. So they finally smartened up to that thing, I think. So that's a little advance. And so they were on the inside. They were part of the negotiations. And that's how they came to have enormous influence on the deal that was finally struck.
But again, after Paris, we got the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We got Trudeau and company declared a climate emergency, as most people know, and then we the next day bought a pipeline. But one thing I found interesting is after Chrétien ratified or went to Kyoto in '97 and then ratified it in 2000, he also went to the tar sands and gave them a lot of money, billions of dollars, to expand the tar sands. So there's a huge déjà vu quality to all of this.
Well, for sure. As you point out, Pierre Trudeau was probably the last Canadian prime minister who could operate without being constrained by neoliberalism. And so every prime minister since has had to operate. You know, you have your voters. You need them to get reelected, but really what they're trying to do is serve the market. And so they're always caught in this way of having to deal with both factors.
Sorry, I just got a low battery sign. I think at this point, Ken, I just wondered if Ken, you could show that cartoon that we got this cartoon Donald, from one of your talks, and I think it sums it up beautifully. And then I'll hand it over to Ken while I plug in my computer. Do you have that handy, Ken? Do you know what I mean, Donald, with the businessmen?
Yes. Yes.
Saying, can you remember what it says? It's quite good. It sums it up well.
Ken, you're on mute.
I can't remember the details. It
Yeah,
wasn't-
I'll get it up in a moment. I'll just get it up in a moment. Sorry, just take me a moment. Go ahead, though.
Okay, well, I'm going to pass it on to Ken anyway, but it basically says that we're going to, the world is heading for a complete disaster. But before that happens, we can make a heck of a lot of money. And but it's all in businessese, and to me, it sums it up. They're again, markets and profits before government regulations and the public and the planet. So it was ever thus, it seems, at least since neoliberalism, as you point out. So I think I'll pass that along to Ken, and you have some questions, and then we'll go to audience questions. Thanks very much, Donald.
Thank you for your questions.
Thanks, Donald. Thanks, Kathleen. Donald, I'd like to dig into a few more specific issues. I think you've set up very nicely the framing of how important neoliberalism is in terms of how things operate. But maybe we could go to a few examples that would help people really understand the depth of the problem. First of all, maybe would you like to talk about methane and methane emissions, and not so much the emissions, but the policy around that and the agreements? And I know there was a big agreement between Obama and Trudeau, but then when Trump got in, he dropped it. And then the Canadian government just went into delay mode, and I was never quite sure why. But maybe you could fill people in a bit on that issue if you'd like to.
Ken, I'm afraid I'm not
Okay.
up to speed on the methane. I know it's an important part of the global warming issue, and is responsible for a fairly large chunk of emissions. But I haven't followed
Okay.
the negotiations between the various parties.
Okay, let's turn to think tanks then. You point out in the book and describe many, many think tanks, almost all the ones we have, many of the ones we have in Canada, and the role they've played and the players in them and where they get funded and stuff. I was wondering if you'd like to discuss that a bit more.
Well, for sure. That's all. I've been following these people for quite a few years, and so they're like, as I say, their purpose is to take neoliberal doctrine and turn it into products to be distributed to an audience. The research, and one of the key strategies is to repeat the same research over and over again. So one thing I used to follow was the ranking of schools. They do that in BC, they do that in Ontario, and I think Alberta as well. And so basically what it shows, this follows from Milton Friedman, who was one of the founders of neoliberalism, and he was always opposed to what he called government schools. He thought schools should all be privately run and privately owned. That's where charter schools come from in the US, and vouchers and things like this. So the idea of the Fraser Institute is to test measure the school results each year, and it shows that the private schools that can control entry, they always do best. And then the schools on the wealthier side of town do next best. And then those schools where the parents have to work, where they don't have the opportunities for educational enrichment, they don't do as well. And they just keep repeating it over and over again. And it's become common sense now that there are better schools and worse schools. And I was researching how people, when they're buying houses, they want to get houses that are near better schools. So they check the Fraser Institute rankings and move over there. And then people on the east side, they want their kids to go to West Side schools. So it's had a big impact on how we see the role of education. This education for the individual. In neoliberalism, there's not society, there's individuals. So rather than having education to promote the well-being of society, we have education to promote the marketability of the individual. So that would be one example. And the Fraser Institute, actually, and they got millions of dollars for this kind of research, and they're still doing it today. So that would be one example.
Would you like to talk about a couple of the ones that actually deal with the climate, put out endless messaging about climate change and economy and environment stuff?
Well, yes, there's still the Heartland Institute, which is based in Chicago, that continues to this day to deny that climate change is occurring. So there's still a market for that kind of message. And of course, it's declining and it's doesn't have an impact, but it still creates confusion about what's really going on. Here in Canada, there's a little known think tank called the Frontier Center for Public Policy, which is based in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And they kind of operate under the radar. That is, they have an internet presence and they disseminate their research through there's these religious Christian broadcasting networks on the prairies. And so they disseminate their messages. So there's still a strong group of people who don't believe in climate change. And this is kind of in the Conservative Party heartland. So that puts some spin on what the Conservative Party can actually espouse in terms of dealing with climate change.
I was wondering, Donald, whether with all the background work you've done on all these think tanks, whether you're continuing to track them.
Not so much anymore. I've been looking actually in a piece of research I've just been finishing, the role of the banks in blocking or stalling action on climate change, and the role that banks play and are continuing to play in financing fossil fuel companies. The most interesting fact I came up with is that since 2014 and since the Paris Accord, the banks have increased their lending to the fossil fuel industry by 50%. So they're talking about sustainability and the green economy, and they have the ESG criteria, environmental, social, and governance criteria, but yet they still continue to boost their lending. And they've got tens of billions of dollars invested in the shares of fossil fuel companies. So that's how I've been continuing to study this situation.
Thank you. My colleague Rolly here, he's actively working on a Fire Your Fossil Bank initiative. That's the big 5 Canadian banks, of course, are all in like just dirty shirts. It's just horrible how much they've invested post the Paris Agreement.
Right. I think our group, this is for the Canadian Centre on Policy Alternatives. And I think once my study comes out, we're going to be working with Rolly's group to try and push forward on this front.
Now that you've mentioned the Center for Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, I was wondering, what's the name of that? They have an initiative to the Corporate Mapping Project. Yeah. I was wondering how you look at their work and your work. It looks like they dovetail beautifully. I don't know what the backstory is on it, but anything you'd like to say about that?
Yes, I'm actually doing this study for the corporate mapping project.
Okay.
Okay, so and it's to map the role of financial institutions in continuing the growth of fossil fuel production. So I'm part of that initiative.
And the corporate mapping project, how would you describe where it looks like a great initiative. I've looked at it before. Where is it taking your work, or where is it taking off from your work, would you say?
Well, they've been mapping the influence of the fossil fuel industry. They've produced probably 20 or 30 studies that you can find on their website. I think if you just Google corporate mapping project, you'll find all their studies. They've been looking at ownership. They've been looking at things like the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board is still, how much money are they still putting into fossil fuel companies here in BC? The BC Pension Plan Board are investing. So they're looking at all these kinds of ways that that the fossil fuel industry is still being supported.
On a webinar last week, Sephora Berman, CanRac webinar, she put up this remarkable picture of Canada, a map of Canada with the interconnections between all these boards of directors from banks, oil companies, gas companies, pipeline companies, investment firms, pension. It was just remarkable. I mean, just stunning, the number of interconnections.
Well, that's what one of the specialties of the corporate mapping project is, to be able to draw these graphs of what it could be interlocking directorships between banks and fossil fuel companies, or it could be all kinds of different ways of mapping, graphing the connections. And I think that's a pretty powerful way of trying to show this situation.
I'm wondering if you'd like to talk more about, in your book, you talk quite a bit about how the business councils, or whatever name iteration it had around 2009 or 2010, how that plan is basically, the Canadian climate action plan is basically an explicit copy of what they were promoting from 2009 on. And you mentioned that Harper didn't really buy into it, but the Trudeau government has just bought it hook, line, and sinker, is my impression from what I read in your book.
Well, this was one of the most astonishing discoveries in my research. Is that it was in 2007, the Business Council of Canada, which is basically a lobby group of all of the largest corporations in Canada. Like most lobby groups, like the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, they represent an industry, but the Business Council of Canada represents the whole of Canadian business. And they got involved in global warming issues right from the beginning. But in 2007, they produced a report. I can't remember the full name, but it was called Clean Growth. And they talked about the need for a national energy program, about carbon pricing, about the need to continue to support the industry. That was 2007. Then when Justin Trudeau finally, after the Paris Agreement, he came out with this what's it called, Pan-Canadian framework on clean growth. And with the parallels between these two documents is startling. We're almost word for word in some areas. And so there's like a 9-year gap between the two documents. And why did that happen? Well, it mainly happened because Stephen Harper was prime minister in the interim, and he would have nothing to do with these kind of planning for a clean growth economy. So he sort of put obstacles in the way of that happening. But as soon as Justin got in, he was right out there with exactly the plan that big business had been espousing for nearly a decade.
Could I just ask here, you're not that happy about the efficiency of carbon pricing, which was one of the things that the BCC, Business Council of Canada, was promoting. Why not? Because of course this is, I mean, Trudeau's almost being hung out to dry as he promotes carbon pricing, as the Business Council wanted him to do, basically. But why are you a bit negative about carbon pricing?
Well, the idea of carbon pricing is to price the externalities. Like if you fill up your tank with gas, you drive around, your exhaust pollutes the atmosphere. You should have to pay for that, and it goes way back to 19th century economic thinking. But the carbon pricing, the extent of the pollution is so high that to cover the total cost of global warming, CO2 emissions, you would ruin the economy, right? You could never, you'd have to be like $400, per unit, whereas we're talking about 20 or 30 or even $50 a unit. So what I look at, it was after denial was sort of laid to rest, the next neoliberal tactic was carbon pricing, because this would still prevent government from taking strong regulatory action. You're still leaving it to the market to deal with it. And let's face it, we've had carbon pricing here in BC for over nearly 15 years, and the carbon emissions are still going up. So it hasn't really worked.
Well, and I think, Donald, that it was a great strategy because the Liberals used so much political capital when they had this 4-year majority where they could have done so much coming right off the heels of Paris. And instead, they just wasted 4 years fighting an inevitable fight with some of the provinces over the carbon pricing. So all the media attention, everything was focused on this one thing that at the levels they're able to get it to is completely ineffective. We're at a situation in 2021 where you've added 9 cents to a liter of gas, which has no impact, and you're going to get that money back. So I just disgusted when they could have been ignoring all the other things they could have been doing, but it was a perfect tactic. All the media filled the media, filled the political spectrum, and no discussion about cutting oil and gas or even restricting the oil and gas industry in Alberta from growing another 40%.
Thank you, Ken. That was a very clear analysis of
My pleasure. Anything else you want to know, Donald? About methane, perhaps. I'd like to turn to Article 6 and Article 4 of the Paris Climate Agreement and Canada's role in that, particularly Catherine McKenna, you've talked before about, and it's in the book. Would you like to discuss those some?
Okay, well, the two articles, one deals with whether CO2 emissions should be mandatory restrictions or voluntary restrictions. Excuse me. The original language for that section was governments shall reduce their nationally determined contributions. That was changed at the last minute to should. Now there's a big difference between shall and should. Shall, you have to do it under penalty of law, let's say. Should, yeah, you do it, yeah, if you don't do it, that's okay. So that was one big change. That was one of the reasons why I say big oil got its deal. The other one was about carbon trading, and carbon trading wasn't supposed to have been in the agreement at all. Like the Kyoto Accord did have mandatory limits, but it also allowed vast carbon trading to occur, and that sort of undermined the whole purpose. So that the idea was to allow carbon trading to occur, and that's what that other section, that Catherine McKenna was in charge of a subcommittee that worked on bringing that forward and having it introduced into the agreement. So,
Go ahead.
Just in your book, you sort of say that carbon trading and offsets were brought in partly because the Trudeau government knew that it wasn't going to reach its promised emission cuts, so they could offset. Is that right?
I think that all the governments know that, and at least the more industrialized nations know that, and they also no, okay, sorry. Yeah, so they did know that, and of course they have to have that fail-safe mechanism to. Oh yeah, the other thing is they what's now become fairly certain is that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is now recognizing the need for carbon capture and storage, and direct capture from the atmosphere is the latest thing, which will another way of preventing direct government control and action on what's going on. So we're hearing more and more about carbon capture. I think just yesterday there's this lab or business in Squamish that has been able to take carbon directly out of the atmosphere, and this is somehow the way we're going to be able to really address the issue without having to give up the use of oil and gas, especially gas.
I was very
Go ahead.
I was very concerned, Donald, to see just yesterday something out from the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, which is the federal government's climate consulting panel. They did a request for proposals, and this group won, and they've gotten, I think you said, $20 million over 5 years. And the report, I started looking at the report, and before I knew it was paid for by the Canadian federal government, I assumed it was paid for by the oil and gas industry, because first of all, I didn't recognize anyone involved in it, and there was no involvement from groups like Eco Justice, David Suzuki, Greenpeace. None of those, or Dogwood, none of those had any play in it at all. And they basically were saying, well, there's many scenarios, and some of them we have high oil and gas use for a very long time and a lot of carbon capture, and no sense of urgency about 2030 with the IPCC says we have to reduce our emissions in half. And I know I talked to you briefly and you said you didn't know too much about it, but to me, it's very disconcerting that this now is the official federal government go-to group for climate choices. It seems like just a continuation to me of quite a bit of neoliberalism.
Well, sadly, that seems to be the direction that we're heading right now. And there's other organizations that are also, there's an Institute for Sustainable Finance at Queen's University, and the same kind of thing. That is that how different scenarios about how we can move forward to a sustainable growing economy in the future. So this is the direction, and unfortunately I feel really sad that it's heading in this direction when it could have been quite different.
Okay, I'd like to, thank you. I'd like to go to a question from John Stevenson. He says, carbon pricing is a regulation. Carbon fee and dividend is not about pricing externalities, nothing so impossible. It's simply about making fossil fuels more expensive than alternatives, including conservation. It's now going to 170 a ton, I guess by 2030 in theory, based on if the Liberals stay in. And exactly how did your crystal ball show that a price of $200 to $300 a ton would ruin the capitalist system?
Well, I said $400 actually, and it's good to see. it's good to see that they are moving to a higher level. I mean, if that will be achieved, that would be excellent. However, so far the results have not been very satisfying in my view.
Well, I think also with the urgency to reduce carbon now, not in 10 years or 15 or 20 years, it's clearly not having any impact yet. And it would have to be a lot higher before it would.
Right.
To continue what John said, too simplistic to scapegoat oil. Paris failure is due to a wicked stew of possibly many factors, but certainly change is costly, fear of freeloading spiced with xenophobia. The carbon budget is not an unchanging number, but an ever-changing probability distribution, and it's impossible to predict actual emissions accurately. The combination of these makes it extremely unlikely that enough countries will ever agree to binding emission targets. A better way would be to agree on global carbon price and keep raising it until there are no more emissions. Your thoughts?
Oh, sounds like a good strategy, actually. Maybe you want to have him on to promote those views. That's pretty interesting.
There was another question from Cecile Wilson. She asked, do neoliberal think tanks get funding from the government or just corporations?
Just corporations, charitable foundations, and individuals. They won't. They pride themselves on not taking any funding from governments.
But at the same time, if they're charitable organizations, they get a tax break, right?
Absolutely.
So they are. I'd say that was funded by government.
Well, they are. That's right. The taxpayers are subsidizing their cheap dollars that they get.
Right. I would like you to just return just for a moment to the Article 6 and the fact that Catherine McKenna in Paris actually spearheaded that movement to get the carbon trading scheme. Maybe could you say a couple more words about that?
Well, I think I've said what I think about it, and it was interesting that it was Canada. I mean, it could have been other countries that took the lead as well, but she was there, and I think they were very seriously because of Canada being such a large producer of fossil fuels that we would have much more of a vested interest in ensuring that this could happen.
Thank you. Rolly, you've been tracking the questions coming in. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask from the audience or yourself at the moment? You'll have to unmute, Rolly.
Yes, a couple of questions. You've touched on a few of them. One is from Louise Brownlee. What do you think Trudeau's C-12, the Climate Accountability Act? You've touched on that, but perhaps the question more specifically, do you think, I know it's in second reading right now, but do you think that there's any openness on the part of the Liberals to modify this bill?
Hey, I haven't been following this closely enough to comment on that. I've just been busy working on this banking study, so I can't really answer that question.
Another question is, are there any countries with policies that are working? And that's in the chat. That's in the chat, and I guess any panelist can any panelist or any participant can respond to that. But Donald, yourself, countries where policies are working?
Once again, my work has been to document what's happened here in Canada and internationally, and I'm not a scientist or an economist. My expertise has been in researching. You could ask me, give me that as a research assignment, and I could go out and find the answer to it, but I can't do it.
I think one way I would respond to that is by just by saying, let's just watch what Joe Biden and the new administration will do. They seem to be very aggressive on climate, and I think that it will put a lot of pressure on the Canadian government to be a lot more progressive as well. I mean, it was easy for Justin Trudeau to look like a climate leader when Donald Trump was in power, but now he's going to look like a climate laggard compared to what the Americans will be doing. So I think that's going to be something to follow.
Yeah, good.
We call ourselves Time for Action because we want people to act. So Ken, could you put up the slide? We've got the number, the phone number and the email addresses of both the Business Council of Canada. And I remember being in the peace movement and an activist in the 80s. And at that point, it was called the Business Council on National Issues. And we saw it as yes. And we saw the Business Council on National Issues, which is now the Business Council of Canada, as even then running the country. They've just had their way, first with Tom DeCino and then with John Manley, and they've got someone new I've never heard of. But, you know, we should be targeting these people. So there's their phone number and email address. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, CAP, has been really aggressive over the last, 30 years. And there's their phone number. And if you want to tell them to stop funding fuels or stop supporting and promoting fuels that are killing our children's future, feel free to go on their website, and on their contact page, you can fill out a form. And I really think we've got to start letting these people know that we're out there and we know what they're up to and have been up to for decades. So, and we've also, last week, we put up Trudeau's email address and phone number, and we can show that in a minute after you've had a chance to look at this. Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, Jonathan Wilkinson, and Seamus O'Regan, who's the head of natural resources. And natural resources is basically the resource voice in the government. And he's pretty keen on developing our resources, so to speak. So we need to get in touch with them as often as possible. As I said last week, I send them articles from Energy Mix and write comments like, you've got to stop funding fossil fuels. And I mean, we just have got to make our presence known better. So I guess we can, do you want to show the other one, the Trudeau one? And then, are we ready to wrap up? Because if we are, I will
I do, Kathleen, I do have another question at least.
Oh, okay.
Donald, in the book, it's so hard to get across the amount of background detail you've put in and the amount of digging you've done so that you know that a meeting happened between Trudeau's people and Notley's people in Alberta, like just days after the Paris agreement, when they came back from the Paris Agreement. And all these, in Notley's government, when the NDP came in, how NDPers who had been working in BC when the NDP government was there, then formed a consulting company, and then they end up with clients that are from the oil and gas industry, and then one of them comes into in a high position in Notley's government, and how those endless interconnections. And I think it's best spelled out by the fact that there are, I always look at a book, I'm a scientist, so I always look at a book to see what the references are, and you've got 30 pages of endnotes in about a font of about 2, it looks like, well, probably 6, but single-spaced font of 6, and 30 pages of them, which just gives you a sense, gives people in the audience a sense of the depth of the article.
Donald's disappeared.
Oh no.
Was he only on for an hour?
No,
Oh.
that's the problem. Oh, we did. I have no
Okay,
idea.
well, we've
Well, that's
almost
a
reached,
good time to end it.
yeah, we've almost reached, I mean, we've reached the hour. So I want to tell people about next week. We're going to talk about green jobs and a fair and just transition. and we have a poster for that all set up in a second. We're going to have Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood, who's a senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and Jim Stanford, who's the director of the Centre for Future Work. President Biden is now promising 10 million green jobs. So where does that leave Canada? As Rolly was saying, we're looking pretty shabby these days. So Jim Stanford has pointed out that less than 1% of Canadian workers are in the fossil fuel industry, and more than 50,000 have lost their jobs since 2014. So the transition is happening, no matter what Kenny and the, as I said, the CAP and the BCC and all these think tanks we were hearing about say. And so he'll be talking about what's their future. And Hadrian will be looking at what happens to unskilled, people in often precarious jobs. How are they going to be helped to create a green future, but also a just and fair future? We can't leave it up to business who do not believe in equality. Look at the difference in wealth these days. We can't leave it up to them to create our new green future. So we'll be talking to them, and that will be very interesting, I'm sure. Both Hadrian and Jim have been working for years on these issues. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and Jim is an economist who's been around for years as well. And so I think they've got a wealth of knowledge. And I think we need to promote training, and even though the oil and gas workers are already losing their jobs, as I said, and they don't make up a huge number of Canadians, Premier Kenny and people like that are going to use their lack of job or their loss of jobs to try to prevent or try to create a backlash and try to make people nervous about moving to a different economy. So we have to be on top of that and make sure we push the change before they can push the backlash or more of a backlash. So that should be interesting. Do you want to close up, Ken?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll put up, I've found that cartoon, which I think would end things well here.
That's not it.
I'm going to get there.
That was a good one, though. Can you read it?
Yes. And so, while the end of the world scenario will be rife with unimaginable horrors, we believe that the pre-end period will be filled with unprecedented opportunities for profit. Oh, Donald, you're back.
Yes.
Sorry. We lost. I don't know what happened.
My computer died. I had to reboot it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
Well, we found the cartoon, and we thought that was a pretty good way to end, especially if you had left.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Donald, for first of all doing that amazing research, as Ken pointed out. Sometimes I feel like you were a fly on every wall as they were conspiring to save big oil. And thank you, viewers, for coming in again, and hope to see you next week.
Yeah, I'd like to add my thank yous to Donald for being with us. I think we could talk for 10 hours about the details in the book. We didn't even get to all kinds of ins and outs of these things, but it's hard to do in the course of an hour. And but I'll put one more pitch for the book. I have no economic ties to this book, but I'd recommend everyone who cares about climate activism in Canada look at it, read it. It's remarkable. It's just an incredible accomplishment. Thank you, Donald.
Mm-hmm. It's an eye-opener.
Do you have any last words, Donald, you'd like to give us?
Well, I just want to thank you both for your kindness in promoting the book and having me on. And it just makes me realize that, my book covers a period up till you know, a few years ago, but now the issues are just carrying on. All of the, I think all of the themes that were established in the book, we can still see them following forward today. So I guess I'm going to get back to looking at these things again, because you've whetted my appetite to look into it more closely again.
Well, Donald, we're a pretty small budget organization, but if you could look into this Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, which I'm sure the Liberals are going to use all the time to rationalize whatever they're doing as this independent think tank, it just doesn't sit right with me. It's just not what the IPC would suggest we need to do by a long shot.
Right.
And it'd be a good place to start.
And Donald, I will be contacting you to, as you said, bridge that gap from when the book was published to now. So you can expect an email from me. Take care. Thank you.
Looking forward to it, Rolly. Thank you.
Okay, the attendees are starting to drop off because it's ending. I'd like to thank all the attendees for being here, and thanks again to everyone involved. We'll see you next week, hopefully.